Hi there. Well, welcome to this morning's talk on Mark, and this is chapter 4. You'll probably all know chapter 4 extremely well, unless you've never really picked up a Bible. In fact, it was one of the first chapters I think I ever read when I was kind of exploring Christianity as a teenager, and I think I got into it because somebody said, well, look, why don't you just kind of explore things a bit and read the Bible? And so I said, well, where do you start? And he said, well, you might as well start with the words of Jesus. So look at one of the Gospels. There's 4 of them. That was news to me. And Mark is the shortest one. It's only got 16 chapters. In fact, I think that person may have told me it was 15, but what's a chapter between friends? Anyway, it's true. It's the shortest of the Gospels. And so Mark has clearly tried to condense down all the really important things that happened during the life of Jesus and what it meant to people around there into the minimum number of verses and chapters as possible. Now, that doesn't mean it's sort of overly concentrated, because actually the words in there are easily understandable, and but just take a bit of looking into properly. So I've called this "How to Hear, How to Speak," and this is quite exciting because my base job is as a teacher. You might think of me as a doctor. That's kind of like what pays my bills. But the bit I really am excited about is actually how you communicate information and attitudes and experiences to other people, so that they can take them on and that they can become part of their lives as well. And this is a very exciting chapter because this is where Jesus also tries to do that with the people that are following him at that stage. So I've called it How to Hear, How to Speak. You could also look at it in a slightly different way, and I've retitled it Crowd's Incomprehensible Parables and Cryptic Sayings, and there's certainly plenty of those. So in a chapter of 41 verses, we've got 4 parables, each of which you'll probably know quite well. They're sort of in popular culture, and one sort of natural miracle, but that was just as a private miracle, so it wasn't something that was done so that everybody could see, and some very, very interesting statements. Let's just have a look at those statements now, because we'll be coming back to them a few times. So he who has ears to hear, let him hear. What does that mean? I appear to have ears, I can hear. There are deaf people who have ears who can't hear. You can definitely be listening to something, but are you really hearing it? Or is it the other way around? So quite an odd sort of statement. So he also says, so that while seeing they may see, but not perceive. And while hearing they may hear, but not understand. Otherwise they might return and be forgiven. So that's Jesus quoting from Isaiah. We'll get back into that in a bit. And again, he comes back to pretty much the same phrase again. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. And then this last statement, which seems to go kind of completely against what you might think is fair and right. But anyone who has, to more shall be given, and whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. So really interesting statements that we've got that are coming up there. So why don't we just take a sort of zoom out for a moment and just have a quick look at where we are in the story of Mark. Now, whenever you're reading the Bible, I find it's really useful to try and look at the bits around the actual kind of key piece of action, so that you can better understand the context that it's happening in. And there's no excuse for not doing that in Mark as well. And so this is my very, very brief attempt. So this is the Gospel of Mark, you can see on the screen right now, and all the different chapters in there as well. So I'm just trying to sort of go through it and see what's happening in those different chapters. So the first chapter is all about commissioning, and then sort of local miracles, talking to people he knows, doing things locally. And then in the next couple of chapters, there's more miracles. He's beginning to draw people who are sort of special people to him, or have sort of some special affinity with his message, or who Jesus thinks will be the sort of people that he'll be able to work more closely with, but hasn't really got there yet. And he's also separating himself out as distinct from other teachers of the time. So he's saying, this is what you've heard from this sort of thing, but this is my spin on it. I'm doing something slightly different with this there. And I've also put the word trending in there because this is obviously a word that we all pick up from something like Twitter. As well, but this is when Jesus is becoming sort of word of mouth. They obviously didn't have Twitter in those days, but this is when Jesus is being told. One person saying, "Oh, look, I've heard of this chap called Jesus," and he's saying some really interesting things. Did you hear that he healed that chap, with the dodgy leg, and there was this person there, and that sort of information, hearsay, is going around the area of Galilee where he's operating at that time, and people are hearing about it. So by the time we get to chapter 4, we've effectively got mass hysteria. And when you read this passage, you can't but get taken by the constant references to the amount of jostling that's going on and the number of people that are around. In fact, it got so bad at one stage that he actually had to leave this crowd. And how Jesus reacts to that is very, very interesting and perhaps not what you might expect. So we'll come back and have a look at that. So moving on through the rest of Mark, we then get some more sort of very big set piece miracles. Then a bit more of a coming back to home, and but at the same time he begins to send out other people. So he's trying to scale up his operation so that other people are beginning to do some of the work in his name. Then from then on, we actually have sort of much more in the way of different aspects, which we won't get into so much because they're not quite so relevant to what's happening in chapter 4. But you can see the rest of the way that it goes through. So what is the situation for Jesus in chapter 4? Well, I'd like to say that he's probably just the centre of a craze. And we've seen similar sorts of things with pop stars and other media people. In fact, how big a craze was a sort of question I was beginning to understand. So if Jesus was around now, well, what would this kind of adulation look like, and how might that come across? So I was kind of trying to compare, and I remembered John Lennon, of course, describing the Beatles in a really rather controversial interview that they were now more popular than Jesus. I've got no real figures on that, although actually the Beatles had worldwide album sales of over 600 million. They sold over 1.6 billion singles in the US alone. So does that make them more popular than Jesus? Good question there. We haven't got any data on that. However, I just had a quick look on the internet. Of course, Cristiano Ronaldo is the most popular person on Instagram, apart from Instagram itself. And there he is. And there's 1 billion Instagram accounts. So basically a fifth of the people on Instagram are following Cristiano Ronaldo. That's quite a lot of people by percentage. And you can go on Instagram and follow him. In fact, probably quite a few of you are already. What about Twitter? So Barack Obama is the most followed person on Twitter, and he has 117 million followers, and that's in some sort of relation to the 1.3 billion Twitter accounts that are actually out there. So just under a tenth of people who are on Twitter follow Barack Obama. So those are the sort of people that have got this sort of platform that perhaps Jesus was had right back in those days in chapter 4. So you've got this kind of following, rather akin to Cristiano or Barack, and not that I'm on first name terms with him, of course, but what would you do with that kind of number of people? So you're the Son of God, you're going to die and be resurrected, and you know that you are the key part of the plan for God's salvation of the world. And perhaps for the first time, you've come out of obscurity. You've stopped just being the carpenter's son and the kid from down the road whose parents are Joseph and Mary, and you've suddenly got a really big audience. So I would be pretty tempted to kind of put out my manifesto at that stage and start telling people about actually what I was doing, what my mission was, how it was all going to work. So does Jesus do that? Well, no. He doesn't do that. He does something actually quite different. So I think what comes across at that stage is neatly encapsulated in this chapter. And he does two things for us here. So first of all, he tells us about actually how the kingdom of God works in some really easy to grasp ideas that pretty much nobody grasped at the time. And secondly, he shows us actually how to get across a message. So let's look at those things in turn.
So we've got 4 parables here.
Here we've got the sower, and you've got your sower up there. You've got your lamp on a stand. You've got things that grow, and you've got some seeds. So I'm afraid to say I'm a terrible gardener, and I'm an even worse cook. But I do know what a seed is, and so we've raided the cupboards downstairs, and as you can see here, we've got some coriander seeds. We've got some cumin seeds. We've got some. These are fennel seeds here, and we've also got some mustard seeds as well. So these are very useful, and although if you were living in the time of Jesus, you probably wouldn't have actually experienced any of these particular seeds, perhaps except the mustard seed and maybe the coriander seed, you'll be very, very familiar with these ideas. So just imagine that you're completely unchurched, you've never been to a church before, you never heard of Jesus, there's just some guy that's talking, you've never experienced a parable before, but some guy comes along and says, look, but also your other relevant background is that you're a farmer, okay, you work in an agricultural community, and some guy says, look, there's a farmer, and he sows some seeds, and you're thinking, yeah, seeds, I get that, yeah, I got some, I sowed some yesterday actually, and he just throws them out, and some land on a path and don't grow. Yeah, why would you throw seeds onto a path? And some land in some rocks, and so kind of spring up, don't grow very well. Yeah, I know I'm not going to sow anything in rocks, and some other ones. The birds come along. Yeah, it's not a good idea to sow when birds are around, because you know what's going to happen, don't you? And then others land on good soil and kind of grow very well, and then we get lots of seed, lots of wheat or barley or whatever back from that. Now, if you were standing listening to this, you would think, well, I haven't really learnt anything. Did I come all this way to listen to this guy tell me how to grow something? And then he says, well, look, if you light a lamp and then cover it over, it doesn't produce a lot of light. And at this point, you're thinking, why have I wasted my morning coming out and listening to this guy? He's not telling me anything I don't know. Then he goes on and says, did you know that if you put seeds in the ground, they just grow, You don't have to do anything. I mean, obviously they need a bit of water, and obviously don't get eaten by the birds, etc. But I've come to listen to this guy. Okay, and then finally he says, well, look, did you know there's these really small seeds? I've actually got some here, some mustard seeds here. They're really small. I don't know if you can see how small they are. Really, really small. And they grow into a really big bush. And you're thinking this guy is just, I don't know what is going on here. This just does not seem a good use of time. Why on earth does Jesus come out with these ones? In fact, they're so bizarre, these parables, to the local people, that although they totally understand the language, they cannot even get the meaning at all. Even his disciples, or the people who are going to become his disciples, haven't got a clue. And Jesus has to explain exactly what's going on with those. We will come to what the parables actually mean in part 2. Okay, because this is some cliffhanger-based education or teaching, because actually this is what Jesus likes to do. And I'd say probably one of the really important things that Jesus is doing in this is not putting out his entire manifesto, but trying to explain that what he's doing in setting out the gospel, in which is going to happen over the next period of years, really, in his ministry as he goes around Galilee, it's not easy. Okay, it doesn't just sort of suddenly come. You can't see it written down. You keep having to go back over it again and again and re-understand things. And as I was getting ready to do this, I thought, I kind of understand this chapter pretty well. And they said, well, do I really? Have I really grasped that? And maybe I haven't. And I think you'll find this a lot in your Christian life, is that the most basic things you keep going back to again and again and again. And things like grace, what is grace? Justice, the kingdom of God. These are really basic things, but they're the sort of things we just need to keep going back to, because this is the fundamentals of actually our relationship with God and how he wants to interact with us. Now, the other key thing that comes out in this is just his use of language. And it occurred to me just how difficult some of our Christian language might be. We quite commonly use words that would be completely incomprehensible to people who haven't been brought up in a church environment. We also do so in ways that are really poor for the human brain. Part of the reason actually I'm going to be stopping talking is because the average length of the human brain to take in new information is about 15 minutes. That's the average attention span. And after that, one tends to sort of waver and start thinking about other things as well. So I'm just going to keep it to 15 minutes. We're going to come back in a bit and actually talk a bit more about the content of the parables. And I'm trying to understand a bit about what this hearing and listening really means. But just before we do that, just have a think about some of those words that I just came out with, which I described as being fundamental. So can you, just in your own mind, think of, well, what do I mean when I say the word grace? Or justice? Or the kingdom of God? So we probably all have our own ideas about what those things mean. But just imagine how they might come across to someone who's had no church background at all. It's quite a sobering thought, isn't it? Just how difficult some of these concepts are to put into sort of definition style words. And for that reason, perhaps that's why Jesus tends to use parables to try and bring over these, because they kind of bypass our normal methods for understanding. In fact, parables are quite a useful way, because really what Jesus was doing there was quite distinct from other teachers of the time. So other teachers of the time, in fact, tend to do what our academics tend to do at the moment, which is quote other academics, quote texts that have already been written a lot, and not really bring anything new or substantially new to the debate or the discussion. Whereas Jesus, he actually had very much his own message, which was quite distinct. It was very simple language, very easy to understand at a surface level at the very least. And it also tended to bypass our normal thinking mechanisms. So a very good example of that is when Jesus explains, well, these little children, this is what you guys need to be like. Everyone kind of understands what little children are like and their relationship with their parents. Immediately a message comes across. So what we're going to do is just have a little break. But before we do that, so a fairly good example of a nice modern parable that actually came along in our Zoom church a couple of weeks ago. And I hope you'll remember a video of a whale that had been trapped in some nets. And after a while, they were able to free this whale, and then the whale swam off. And this was all about being trapped and being in chains and having restrictions on your life. All of the things that Jesus wants to eliminate so that you can be truly free. So that's a really simple parable to understand. But the parables also bring along a mystery, because there's many layers of understanding even in that one. And that reminds me very much of actually before I met Jesus for myself and understood anything about Christian life and how things like this word grace works. I was just fascinated by what was going on with Christians and what sort of relationship did they have with someone they called God. I didn't know this God. What was going on in church ceremonies? Why were people doing all sorts of strange things? There was a mystery there. And this is something that's retained right at the centre of our relationship with God. There is some mystery there. We don't understand everything. Our experience is not full. And because of that, it's an amazing open space for us to explore. So I'm going to break now, and we're going to have a bit more exploration around that, particularly around hearing and listening a little bit later on. See you for now.